I think the best thing to do is to let Robert Mueller do his job. I think the best vindication for the president is to let this investigation go on independently and thoroughly.
House Speaker Paul Ryan, one of a chorus of Republican leaders warning President Trump not to fire the special counsel who's investigating links to Russia and a possible attempt to obstruct justice. And we're back now with the panel. Well, Julie, you've got quite a story out this week from AP saying that the president feels increasingly under siege about the investigation and is now taken to yelling at the television when he sees coverage of the investigation. What can you tell us about what the president's mood is?
Well, the president increasingly sees himself as a victim of a politically motivated attempt to undermine or perhaps end his presidency. And what really seems to have him frustrated, according to some
You could argue that he's right about that.
You could, except that this investigation is going to go on, whether he feels that way or not. And one of the things that his associates, his advisors say is that he's frustrated because he doesn't have the ability to control this. So you see him lashing out in these various ways on Twitter. He is consumed by the coverage of this investigation, and he watches it in real time. From the minute he wakes up until the minute that he goes to bed, he has the televisions on, he's watching what's being said about him, and it's really fueled this anxiety because, again, this is not something he's going to be able to control. This is something that is going to continue, and the tweets and his reactions to this seem to actually be causing the investigation to expand, not contract.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that. I mean, there are two things that can both be true here, Lisa. One, it can be a witch hunt. It can be an effort by his opponents to bring him down. But you can also argue that he's made things worse. James Comey kept telling him he's not under investigation, so he fires Comey. Now he is under investigation. And then there are those tweets.
I think you're right. I think both of those can be true. And look, the president had every right to fire Comey. I think the problem was, one, the conflicting messages from the White House, and then also the alleged conversations that happened between him and the FBI director. But if you're the president, I actually think calling this a witch hunt is a smart political strategy. Because if you look at it from the sense of, okay, so you have the FBI director who the New York Times said made an extraordinary statement, I think it was back in March, announcing the fact that they were looking into Trump associates and the Russians in regard to Russia. So, but meanwhile, behind the scenes, telling him that he himself is not under investigation, while everyone else is calling for impeachment for him. Then you have the former FBI director leaking memos, as he said, to force a special counsel investigation when he took instruction from Loretta Lynch to call it a matter as opposed to investigation. And now he's allegedly being looked at for obstruction of justice, despite what Senator Risch pointed out when Comey testified at the Senate Intelligence Committee. Nobody's ever been prosecuted for using the word hope. So I think actually calling this a witch hunt is a smart political strategy, looking at all of those things.
All right. Enough about all of this. We're going to talk about one of the real subjects affecting people's lives that you all want to hear about. And I want to turn to President Trump announcing this week that he is partially rolling back President Obama's opening of diplomatic and economic ties to Cuba. Here he is.
America has rejected the Cuban people's oppressors. They are rejected. Officially today, they are rejected.
Brit, how significant is the president's decision, really, when you consider the fact that, yes, he is rolling back some things. On the other hand, the U.S. Embassy in Havana is going to stay open. U.S. airlines, U.S. cruise ships are still going to be able to serve the island.
What he did was he dialed back part of the outreach to Cuba, a signal, I think, to the Cuban-American community in Florida and elsewhere that he is with them and would like to see the Castro brothers done it. There's not going to be any real détente between the U.S. and Havana, between Washington and Havana, but it was not. He called it a complete rollback, reversal. It wasn't really a reversal.
We asked you for questions for the panel, and we got this on Facebook from Pamela Murray, who writes, "What benefit did we gain by changing the policies in the first place?" One, how do you answer, Pamela, and specifically the question of, after President Obama in 2014 had this opening, this effort to reach out to the Castro regime, did they really release ease up on the repression, political repression in the country?
No, the short answer to Pamela is no. The thing is, I'm going to say this on a very personal level. I was somewhat conflicted. I was a critic of the Obama rapprochement because, to me, my family had experiences in Latin America with these Castro-like dictators. It's not healthy. It's repression, and a repression that leads to political prisoners, as you were describing. But the thing is, Chris, you have 50+ years of failed U.S. policy with regard to Cuba that has not led to the release of political prisoner, increased human rights, or even press freedoms in Cuba. So the idea that you would have, and this is specifically in answer to Pamela, an infusion of Americans with American values, American capitalism, and American democracy coming into Cuba, challenging the way of life, giving people new reason for hope is, to me, a significant change. And one of the realities...
But you agree that in the 2.5 years that it was in place, it didn't actually change the way things were going on there.
No, it changed. I think if you care about the Cuban people, yes, there was change. If you're saying were prisoners released, did press freedoms increase? No, but this is a slow and steady process, and there was no change in the previous 55 years.
Chris, this has been an enduring debate as to how to deal with these dictatorial regimes. One theory holds that if you open commerce up, as we've done with China, for example, that eventually that will have a democratizing effect and will tend to diminish the repression. Results from China, I think, are mixed at best as to whether that's effective. I think it was worth a try. Cuba's a somewhat different case because they have a 1920s economy there, and the early indications, as one suggests, at least on the political repression, is that it has not ended. I think it remains to be seen whether the commerce will have the effect that we hope it will have, but that's a long-running debate, and there's no certain answer as to whether that works or not.
Julie, in the White House, how do the Trump officials, advisors reconcile his call and his defense of human rights in Cuba with, a few weeks back when he was in the Middle East, his silence on that issue when he was in Saudi Arabia?
It's a pretty jarring contrast. I was on that trip in Saudi Arabia, and this is a country that other U.S. presidents have dealt with despite their pretty grim human rights record. So it's not as though Trump is the first person to do it, but he completely ignored the human rights violations when he was on that trip. Yet we hear him talking about Cuba and saying that this is a human rights issue. You can look at this two ways. You can say that this is cynical and this is just an attempt to try to roll back something that Obama did, or you could look at people like Marco Rubio and some of these other lawmakers who truly do believe that this is a human rights issue and have been putting a lot of pressure on this White House to take this step.
One important difference. Cuba's an American adversary, for sure, has been forever. Saudi Arabia is an ally and has been for a very long time.
Yeah, but I think Cuba's our neighbor, and we know, they have posed a direct threat to us going back to Khrushchev and the like, and it's time for change. The younger generation in Florida of Cubans, they're for Obama's plan. It's the older generation that I think is still entrenched in the hatred, anger.
Well, let's not diss the older generation.
No.
Thank you, panel. See you next Sunday.